on September 12th, 2024, we saw the most recent administrative monetary penalty, or AMP, from FINTRAC on a MSB based out of British Columbia. The fine totaled a little over $315,000, which is not a small fine when it comes to FINTRAC standards based on some of what we've seen lately. Piece I want to kind of focus on here is the fact that there's 6 violations, and this was in a 6-month period. So the information provided by FINTRAC in the announcement is actually pretty detailed of what exactly occurred and what led them to this administrative monetary penalty, which is very beneficial for folks within the space to make sure that they understand how FINTRAC is looking at these. Violation number 1 is related to 2 unreported STRs or ASTRs. 2 seems like a low number to be considered in anything, but frankly, any unreported STR is going to be scrutinized by FINTRAC. 2 of those, it's hard to extrapolate exactly what occurred and why these 2 are such a big deal. There may be more information that isn't readily available, but what caused these and the indicators that were there were the person was using different locations to conduct their transactions, and it appeared that they were structuring their transactions in order to avoid identification. The additional factor included a high-risk jurisdiction being involved, so assumption is that the person was sending money to a foreign jurisdiction that is considered high risk and was structuring those transactions in order to avoid identification. Second violation is related to a failure to submit large cash transactions, and if you read through the contents, it says later that in the 3 instances, they received 2 or more cash amounts totaling $10,000. It appears that these were triggered under the 24-hour rule. Similar to the first scenario, when you're looking at the unreported STRs, it appears that these cash transactions were done at different locations, which is one of the factors they called out in the unreported STR. So it seems like someone was coming in, going to different locations, dropping off cash below the reporting threshold. So violations 3 and 4 are similar. They're both related to unreported electronic fund transfer reports. 25 of them related to outgoing or funds being sent out of Canada, and then 4 related to incoming or funds being received in Canada from a foreign jurisdiction. Again, similar to the LCTRs, it appears based on the language from FINTRAC that these have been triggered under the 24-hour rule. You need to be sure that when you are aggregating 24 hours that you are looking for not only your customer, but who they're sending the money to, or who they're receiving the money from, or if there's third parties involved and things like that. So you're looking for common factors and where you have something that is connected. So where the initiator is the same person who's not your customer, this is someone in a foreign jurisdiction sending money into Canada, you need to make sure that you're aggregating those transactions on that initiator, because that would fall under the 24-hour rule, even if it went to different beneficiaries, i.e. different customers within your institution. So looking into violation number 5, you're into the scenario where we've moved on to the documentation side of the violations. The first 4 violations are related to the operational piece, so unreported transactions. Moving into the program piece, this is failures related to the compliance program itself, so the documentation. As you read through this, you very quickly realize that they did in fact have documentation. It existed. The problem is that they weren't following it. And this is one of the big disconnects we see in effectiveness reviews, in FINTRAC exams, in just talking with clients. It's usually kind of one or the other. We have this awesome process, but it's not written anywhere. Or we have this awesome process, but we forget steps 2 and 3. Both of these situations are less than ideal, but having an awesome process that isn't documented is better than having an awesome process that's documented and not being followed. I don't know how awesome their processes are in this scenario, but it doesn't matter because they weren't being followed. And as you read through these, you will notice that there are processes related to reporting. They are documented, and it just says very clearly in the statement that they're not following it. Similarly, there are processes for ongoing monitoring. They're documented. I don't know how quality they are, but regardless, if you have quality procedures, you have to make sure that you're following them. And whatever you say you're doing, you have to make sure that you're doing it. If there's 5 steps, you have to do all 5 steps. You can't do 1, 2, 3, skip 4 and do 5 because you're not following your own process. Even if that 4th step isn't an obligation, if it's just something additional that you say, hey, this is a really good control that we can implement, let's do that, and then you don't do it, you're going to get called out in effectiveness reviews, you're going to get called out in exams as not following your process, and that is considered a deficiency during an exam. The other item in here is they don't even have processes related to the ministerial directives. So that's a big one as we start to see ministerial directives used more and more, such as the recent one we saw earlier this year related to Russia. They also didn't have any processes related to PEPs, politically exposed persons, head of international organizations, or family members and close associates related to that person. These are factors that didn't seem to be called out during the operational portion, but without kind of a real heavy in-depth look and verification of whether they missed some of those, I think this is kind of FINTRAC saying, hey, you need to make sure you're covering these things, and especially when it comes to ministerial directives, because you're dealing with kind of the security related to Canada as a country. So it's a big deal, and you better make sure you have documented processes of how you're following it. Also, how you're staying up to date on new MDs as they come out. So number 6 is moving on to the risk assessment portion of the documentation. So we went through the P&P, that's what was called out there. Now we're into the risk assessment. And mainly the biggest one here I see is that they're not applying their customer risk rating. So they're not risk rating their customers. And it goes into more detail that they're not assessing the risk with the categories of products, delivery channels, and geography. Like, I mean, those are not the core of what you're doing, but they're big portions of your risk assessment. You need to understand the risks related to cash-to-cash foreign exchange, the risks related to international remittance. These are high-risk categories, and geography is a given. There's updates coming from the Financial Action Task Force, or FATF, all the time of countries subject to increased monitoring. There's a sanctions list in Canada of what countries are sanctioned, which recently came into the purview and called out very specifically from FINTRAC of sanctions evasions and indicators related to sanctions evasion. So you better be doing an assessment of the countries related to sanctions so that you know if someone is trying to avoid sanctions. The assessment of risk geographically, not only from where you're sending money and receiving money from, where's your customer located? So when you get into the ongoing monitoring piece, there just appears to be none taking place. The other thing that was called out is additional measures for high-risk monitoring and high-risk activity. So where you're looking at a customer who's assessed as high risk, you need to do enhanced due diligence, or EDD. I think you're stacking problems here where if you're not risk rating your customer, you're not going to know that you need to do EDD. That said, if you you might have been able to collect additional information, which lowers the risk related to that customer. So these are the enhanced measures that are being referenced here, things that need to be considered when you're looking at high-risk customers. Nothing says that you can't have high-risk customers. You just have to do something more for that high-risk customer than you do for everyone else. So as you see, violations 5 and 6 are program related. So those are things you didn't have written down. That we can absolutely help with. We can make sure that those are documented. We can make sure they're well understood. We can make sure they're actually doing what they're supposed to. You got to make sure that the measures that you're doing are effective, because all the enhanced due diligence that you do, like, you can totally collect the second piece of ID, but if your concern or risk factor isn't related to the customer's original identification provided, what value is that adding? Maybe you should ask for an invoice or a bank statement or some other piece of information depending on what the actual factor is. From a documentation perspective, it's pretty simple to make sure that they have their documents in order, especially when you get a response like this from FINTRAC, because it tells you exactly where attention needs to be paid. That said, violations 1 through 4, that is a training and oversight problem. We are less able to ensure compliance on this. The best we can do is provide training, provide assistance, and kind of show exactly how reporting is done, help implement additional controls. So maybe an oversight function that's beyond either the compliance officer, maybe someone in senior management who is also reviewing transactions or alerts to make sure that, hey, we had something that was captured under the 24-hour rule. The other thing that I would probably suggest, again, without knowing the exact situation, is look at some sort of service provider that can automate at least some of the monitoring for reporting, and if not a portion, like a large portion of the reporting, because there are companies out there that will assist with the alert generation, but also with the population and sometimes submission of FINTRAC reporting, large cash, EFTs, even suspicious in some instances. The operational piece really comes down to more of training and probably some sort of automation.